The Pope is dead. Long live the Pope. Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Polity's podcast. We are so excited to have you here to reflect a little bit on the life and pontificate of Pope Francis. I'm here with Reuben Slife.
Hello.
A man who thinks about the Pope a lot more than you and a lot more than me. So I'm hoping to learn a good deal from you, Reuben. This is especially, I won't say coincidental, because it does seem providential, that our publication, Modernity's Alternative, arrived in the actual book form in a whole palette of packages much earlier than we thought. Now, anything arriving early is an impressive feat for New Polity, I admit. But this one happened after the, frankly, unexpected death of Pope Francis. And Pope Francis wrote the introduction to this book. And so receiving it felt like receiving a word from the Pope. And I was reading through that introduction, which we read a few times, obviously, in the editorial process.
Some of us more than a few times.
Yeah, that's right. But reading it after his death was a comfort to me. It felt like a father who I'd lost had left a letter in his nightstand or something like that. And reading through it made me realize that we do not and have not yet understood the man Francis, and more importantly, understood our leader, Francis, and the ways in which we have been led as a church. And this book, Modernity's Alternative by Rocco Buttiglione, is a effort, among a few things, to describe the roots of Pope Francis's vision, of his theology, a little bit of his biographical situation, of course, but more importantly, where his ideas come from.
Yeah, and not so much because he was the Pope. It's not a book on Francis exactly. What it is a book on theology of peoples.
That's right.
Theology del Pueblo. And please forgive me for not being able to pronounce Spanish.
Pueblo.
Teología del Pueblo, Theology of Peoples, was a movement in Latin America, a theological movement, started in Argentina and spread across the rest of the continent. And Francis, at that time, Bergoglio, was a part of it when he was younger. So it's not so much a book on, let's, go and see if we can find the roots of Pope Francis. It's just a book on the movement, which is basically unknown in our corner of the world. Yeah. But since what we do here is political theology, and it's theology of peoples, and that's a fundamental political category, it seemed like a good book for us. And it so happens that it is closely connected to Francis, the roots of his thought and spirituality, and so it is particularly fitting that it arrive at this time. It arrived just yesterday, 2 days after his very sudden death. So I learned quite a lot about him from this book, and I mean about many things, but particularly about him and an ability to interpret what he was about and what we have unavoidably inherited. When a man who is Pope dies, obviously he's no longer leading the church, but everything he has done, it doesn't disappear.
No.
It's like, Humanae Vitae in a way. That didn't have a glorious history during St. Paul VI's actual pontificate. Yeah. But it remains there as what would you call it? A landmark.
Sure.
It continues to exist as an authority that
right.
shapes the church. And so Francis, what he said and did has passed into the permanent magisterium. And
he's not going anywhere.
He's not. And so, the church's life has had something happen to it and happen in it that we have to sort through sometime or other, because it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was first introduced to the idea of a theology of peoples, it was introduced to me by someone whose I think brain was calcifying, because they introduced it to me as a light liberation theology. You got like a light beer of
like Episcopalian liberation.
Yeah,
theology.
precisely. And this book just blew that out of the water for me. I was so impressed by the articulation of the theology of the people as arriving from Francis's concrete situation. So in 1973, there's a whole history going on in Argentina where Perón and the movement that he sort of established, a very odd political figure, but definitely a source of unity in Argentina.
And other things.
Yes. He dies after taking power for the second time, and a military coup sort of erupts. And on the one side, you've got the Montoneros. These are essentially, although I think there's some important differences to, a more European understanding, but essentially a communist movement that is very open to a violent, terroristic,
military movement.
Yeah.
I mean, they're guerrillas, basically.
Guerrilla warfare, exactly. And then, of course, as you're probably very familiar with, on the other side, the military proper, with its essentially anti-communistic regime that is equally violent.
The military dictatorship that says, no, we're the government, there will be order, we must defend Christian civilization against these people who wish to destroy everything.
That's right. And so there's this rift. And so the Pope is...
And by rift, we mean basically something verging on a civil war.
Yeah, murderous. I mean, people dying.
In the streets.
Yes.
And by dying, being killed in the streets.
Yeah.
By two sides which want to kill each other. And as Buttiglione says in the book, the two sides were not just trying to kill each other, they were trying to get everybody to pick a side.
Right.
They wanted it to be able to turn into an open civil war where we could just decide who's going to win.
Right. The victims of this warfare were very often the people who wouldn't side with either group because, a nation, a people, does not want to be at war with itself. So that inevitably, whenever we get to a conflict, an actual civil war, verging on a civil war, the majority of people are going to be suffering it, like in agony over it, and not the actual factions. Now, Bergoglio, at this time, is having friends assassinated. So I think it's difficult for us to understand sometimes, like, what does it mean to have friends disappear and then die in car crashes that are obviously caused by the military
government
regime? Like,
yes.
there's a level of unthinkability.
That's not the world we live in.
But that world was his world. It was covered in blood. And there's a question that he brings to bear, which has the kind of sound of a pragmatic question. And I think sometimes people can confuse his pragmatism with a reduction of ideas, because he's asking a question. Then,
I wouldn't say. I would just be careful about the word pragmatism. He's speaking of practical matters.
Yeah, right.
I do not think he's a pragmatist.
No. I mean, the American pragmatists kind of poison that particular well. But no, what I mean is he wanted the killing to stop.
Right. That's a practical goal.
Absolutely. And
let's stop the killing.
And so he develops, because of this horror of the actual killing and of this sense of a people who are being hurt by not picking extreme ideologies on either side, he develops a love of the human person, that there is, there is a sort of sense of this love as being grasping, like, in these differences, which are real and in these difficulties, nevertheless, there is something that does not change, that unifies us, that we are humanity together. Human
nature, human dignity, if you
will. I think that this right away, so I mean, this is 1973 and around, this gets confused because he obviously brings it into his pontificate, and in a way that...
Yeah, and he's not the only one developing it at that time. I mean,
my gosh.
It's also a thing that the movement of theology of peoples had already started in Argentina, though that's certainly one factor that made it important to develop it further. And because, I mean, one thing you can say is it's Argentina, right? So basically everybody is Catholic at some level, in some sense, in some way. And yet they are killing each other in the streets. And over concerns like, we want to protect Christian civilization, and the other side saying, well, we want to provide for the poor.
Yeah.
And somehow this cashes out into, we're going to kill you and anyone who won't agree with us.
Right.
And there just comes a certain point at which a guy can be a heretic, and that's bad, but killing him in the street is not the correct option. Mm-hmm. And the degree of exclusion from unity that had been reached there, it's not just like, oh, he's not one of us, he's a heretic, he's outside, but he's so outside we can just kill them, we can liquidate them and be done with it. Yeah. And that created a pressure to really think through what unity is and on what basis it comes. Yeah. And how much. Well, anyway, you were saying that this season of the pontificate. I was just pointing out that it's not him alone thinking this through. He's part of a whole body of thought going on here.
And you mean look at John Paul II. I mean, the idea of the dignity of the human person is obviously
right.
the watchword of the last few papacies. And there's no doubt.
Yeah, though in John Paul's case, it's derived from an experience somewhat similar of communism, but in that case, it's entirely a sort of top-down thing. You have a government that's oppressing the Christian people who don't want it.
That's right.
But in Francis' case, what you have is two groups that sort of spring from the Christian people, in some sense, that are tearing it apart.
Yeah, right.
And so he's not so much concerned with resistance to the power in the name of truth, as with getting the killing to stop and us to admit the unity we possess and try to work toward unity, as opposed to just wanting the other guy to go away.
Absolutely. And I think that when I saying that it was brought into the pontificate, I think, Pope Francis, everyone will say this, we're going to read hundreds of the worst articles in the world that will come out and provide either would-be flattering portraits of the man that totally miss the point, or these sort of terse, traditionalist, we learned something, I suppose, from him, and now we can move on and elect a real pope. That'll be the sort of dichotomy.
We may have already read hundreds of those articles.
I'm getting sick of it, if you can't tell. But
so we're about to say some things you're not going to hear anywhere else.
There's just, and one of those things is that when he kind of arrived as a bolt from the blue, the first Latin American pope, the first non-European pope since 783, I think, when we had a Syrian. He arrives, and we don't know where he's coming from. And of course, by no fault of our own, we imagine that he's coming from sort of where we're coming from. And especially in America, this is a big problem because we have a deep difficulty of understanding other places. I mean, this is just part of our...
We've never seen them. They're very far away.
Well, they're far
the US
away, but
big.
It's part of our national character is like, the American abroad is a bit of a joke.
Yeah. And even when we have seen them, yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so there was this phenomenon. So of course we read, with a little bit of imagination, this discussion of a equality of all human beings, of this love for humanity, as having some sort of liberalizing root. That is to say, okay, the church, the Catholic thing is not so important. It's subordinated in some way to this human thing, which is where all the good. So we're basically imagining that he comes from the same kind of enlightenment that we come from, and he's just one of the bad guys of our narrative.
Yeah. If any of you have ever been to Asheville, North Carolina, you will occasionally see something very strange. If you're there, you'll just be downtown, and out of an alley will step somebody like it was a time portal from the 1970s, like full hippie, head to toe, dressed like they just left Woodstock. And I think that's a little bit how people looked at Pope Francis. Like, we don't know where he came from, so we assume he came from our mental image of the 1970s.
Totally.
And
but his 1970s was blood on the streets. I mean, let's just be clear.
1973,
friends being assassinated. And so when he appeals to a unity, it is because it is not the same thing as this negation and subordination of the particularity for the sake of some vaguer, neutral universal. It's more akin, and I think really in the end is, to that idea that unity is attained when we break down the dividing wall of hostility that Paul speaks about in Ephesians between Jew and Gentile. That in Christ, there is a new form of unity that's possible to us. Because war has this appearance of impassibility, this just absolute frustration of human desire for flourishing. Like we're killing each other instead.
Yeah.
And there's this sense in which there is nothing human that can put a stop to this once blood starts flowing.
The only thing to do with the enemy is destroy him.
Right, exactly.
And then we can have only our friends left.
So for the church to act in that situation and say, and yet peace is possible.
Your enemy.
And yet, love your enemy. And yet this dividing wall of hostility can be destroyed, not because of man, but because of Christ and his revelation to the people. This hostility can be overcome. That's where the idea of a unified human nature comes from. That's where, for Francis, very practically. So when he is speaking with theologians and frankly leading a theological movement in Argentina, we have this tendency to go back to where I began, which is that theology of the people, and so Pope Francis was described as a sort of liberation theology light to me, when in fact it is aggressively anti-Marxist, because the Marxist wing is precisely one of the ideologies that's firing the guns, right? Even as it's anti-fascist in that sense, that's not a good term to use these days.
Actually being opposed to fascism.
Opposed to fascism. Who are also willing to shoot the guns. And then again, we have this tendency to say, okay, well then the theology of the people must be a mediating position between the two. Okay, you mark out an extreme, Marxism is too much this way. You mark out the other extreme, fascism is too much that way. And the
so
church
what if we were a little Marxist, a little fascist?
What if we just had a third way? But actually the discussion that they have is how to, the theologians involved in this movement, is how to bring the power of Christ to bear to produce a social miracle where the blood stops.
Yeah, social unity.
Yeah.
Social, what is it that, was it Pius XI calls it social charity?
Yeah. I know. And you read even in the church's sort of social tradition, as it were, I think you get a sense for the kind of miraculous application of the peace that Christ alone can bring in some of their phrases. So, in Rerum Novarum, there's that famous advocacy for friendship between capital and labor. Like that's the ideal, is that we're friends.
Yeah.
And the Marxists look at this and their heads explode. Like, how could this be? All of it is conflict. You can't undo that conflict.
Well, and plenty of other people who are not Marxists and don't like Marxists will look at that and say, friendship, isn't this just too sentimental?
Yeah, totally.
We need justice or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Which, to be fair, I mean, we need justice, but justice exists inside love where it doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. I found this experience within, maybe just to wrap up this explanation of what unity meant to Pope Francis.
And to theology of the peoples.
And to theology of the peoples, which is not a humanity that is somehow above a particular people, and certainly not the people of God in terms of the Catholic Church, but a humanity whose peace has been achieved by the blood of Christ and by none other. That experience is what he brought to the pontificate and said, and we can do it again, and we can always do it again. And wherever there's this hostility, this wall can be torn down. That's what I'm trying to get at. And I think that there's a experience that we all have in the family that I call it an appeal to a higher plane, and that Pope Francis often would speak in this way about like meeting on a higher level with someone.
Yeah. And
it can be kind of confusing because it comes with that Woodstock assonance that he knew nothing of and wouldn't care to, wouldn't have cared to hear, which is this sort of like consciousness raising ideal.
The age of Aquarius.
Aquarius, yeah.
Mystic crystal revelation.
Yeah, we're just gonna meet on the astral plane there, my brother. No, we're not astral plane surfing. We are doing what we do in the family all the time, which is you'll be in a family and you'll have some conflict erupts because you are, your brothers and sisters, but someone has stabbed someone else with a fork in the nose or something like that. And it seems because blood is flowing that there's like an irreconcilable violence and with nothing to intervene, violence will breed violence, and that'll be the end of the family unity. But what happens, of course, in the family is not a sort of rigorous moral judgment by which all wrongs are righted and strict justice is achieved and retribution is affected according to sort of a chart by which one stab in the nose equals this, that, and the other. No, it's this appeal to a unity that is greater than all the parts, right? You say, you must love each other. You are brothers and sisters. All right. You must love each other. Do it for the kids. You must love each other. Whoever is at conflict. Yeah. The healing comes in with a reference to a higher form of unity that you both share, but then also needs to be continually realized. And that's the analogy that I always think of when I think of the way the Pope would address the conflicts of the church and the world, frankly, which is this appeal to the kind of unity that we have in Christ already, that's always available to us, which, again, I think it was often received as like, well, don't worry about strict justice and sort of rigorous accounting. Just love each other, man, as if that was somehow easy. But it's the hardest thing in the world, actually, is to, especially outside of the family, to say, I know that there's this mess of conflict, but I'm going to appeal to an abiding peace that I believe in, that is real, and that doesn't come from man, but comes from God. And we're going to actually attain results between you and I. And that's hard. But I think it is, at the end of the day, what he saw happen in Argentina. And so it is what he believed Christ could do in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's an experience of a problem in one's life, in the life of one's society, and there's an attempt to find a solution to that the church brings, a theological solution, a solution coming from God. And I think we can move on here to another point, a closely related one. We've mentioned that the movement is called Theology of Peoples. It's Teología del Pueblo. And so the people is a fundamental concept in his thought, and it's one we're not familiar with just in the English language, hardly at all. For us, people is a plural of the word person. So when we hear the people, what we mean is, what we understand, what we hear is the masses, the accumulation, the numerical aggregation. And that's just not what the word means in Spanish. It's also not what the word means classically in basically any language. And so even when we use the word in English as kind of a singular, like we the people, we still think of it as an aggregate, a liberal sort of, all the people banded together and said this, and it's the majority.
Right.
But because of this concern, this deep concern which has been brought to the fore by their historical circumstances, with people tearing the unity of the society apart, they came to this focus on social unity. And as you said, that fundamentally the only thing that makes unity between sinners is Christ. But there are other things we share, and you kind of need them all, right? Christ doesn't operate in a vacuum. He knits nature back together. And so human dignity is one of them. And also just the actual culture, the tradition, the life of the people to which you belong. Like in Argentina, they're all Argentinians. Now, in that case, the question of what is Argentina is a complicated and controverted question, and was at the time, because the country had a history of division. But you have to find what in your history produces the unity. Anyway, so the people in this way of thinking about it is not an aggregate, it's a unity. Yeah. And it's an interior unity. It's a depth. It's not just like we all share, we make this kind of food, we do this kind of dances, we have textiles of this sort. And I think in our thought, we tend to think of traditions and culture almost in terms of like consumer goods, where they're things. We pass this on, we pass that on, instead of you're passing on a unity, a life. When a child is conceived, for example, what's passed on is a unity. It's the form of humanity that then structures the thing as it grows. And it's the same way, I think, with tradition. You're transmitting a cultural unity. It's a spiritual depth that involves the depths of all the things of the world and the way you relate to them. So a people is a unity. It's a unity based on a depth and an insight, and it's something that grows over time. Like human life, right? You have challenges you face in your circumstances, your things you deal with. You grow, you move forward as you deal with things and advance. And a people is the same way. It's a corporate life. It's a thing that has steps and stages and can't remain the same as it was. It's a dynamic unity, as right. Buttiglione says at one point. Yeah. And furthermore, what's the sentence here? It's something like a dynamic unity has to constantly be reconstituted.
Reconstituted, yeah.
Because it's not something you can just sit back and go, we're a people.
Yeah.
Anyway, that concept is a fundamental thing for this theology because it's concerned with social unity. Mm-hmm. And so this enters into Francis' understanding. So one thing he said a lot was the church is the people of God.
That's right.
And this, again, was one of those things that people go, whoa, it's the 1970s, redivivus.
Yeah.
And he's just coming from a different context. Yeah. For him, people is a very content-full notion. And if you look at what he actually said, almost always he would not just say the people of God. He would say the holy, faithful people of God. Mm. He would be clear that holiness and faith are part of this. Mm-hmm. But he thought of the church itself at a fundamental level as a united body of people existing in time, moving from this to that and dealing with life as it comes. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very I could say historical. It's not ahistorical, right? It's not just like ideal church as a structure, as a thing which has to be this and not that.
And living in the sense of not
organic and growing.
Right, like each instantiation of the thing is different because it's real and it's alive, as opposed to a identical repetition of the same over time, which is, of course,
right.
a view of the church that liberals are, and I mean classical liberals, conservative or leftist, whatever, are especially tempted towards because they view human society as attained through a sort of contractual constitution. And so we view our societies at a very deep level as being fossils, dead things that at some point were agreed upon, in which we enter into and strive to reinstantiate in the same way again and again.
Yep.
America is America. The church is the church is the church. And then for any deviation or an apparent difference to be immediately perceived of as death, as a sort of, or not even death, just like the cracking of the fossil form. It's like, well, if it's different, then it's not the same thing. Whereas in human life, the life of a person and therefore of people, difference is the sign of its vitality. Because
right. And the form of the person, the soul, form of the body, remains the same over time.
That's right.
The fundamental nature of the unity doesn't change, but the person grows.
Yeah. And
the person grows without turning into like a whale or something. Yeah. But so growth and continuity in being are not opposed things. Totally. It's simply recognition that we are historical beings. The church exists in history. Yeah. And so that this is really fundamental to his thinking, and it's, I think, very unfundamental to our thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just blindsided us. I think it still does.
One of the ways in which I think that was clear is the idea that a people can act together, and that this is somehow a sign of being a people and belonging to a people, is that there are with me people with whom I act. Mm-hmm. And that the church is understood in this manner for Francis. And I think that's also a particular blind spot we have, because within contemporary liberal nation states, the idea of being with a people who has the power to step out in some new direction is very troubling. It's troubling because it seems like it doesn't fit with the idea of of sovereignty, of a constitutionally established thing that we're all doing, of a rule of law. The idea that things might all change because we all act together in some different way, I think, is alarming.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. One thing I would wish to be clear about is that even though we're the subject, the protagonist, if you will, it's an acting subject, as St. John Paul would say.
Yeah.
It's still not entirely in our command.
Totally.
Like, just when you're a human being, right? You're living, life happens to you, and then your growth comes from figuring out how to respond to that, how to manage it in a way that is living and real, like where you actually manage to absorb and metabolize what's happening to you.
Yeah.
And it's the same way for peoples, that history occurs. Yeah. Things happen, and they have to, so when they go out in a new direction, it's not just we made a choice to do a new thing.
Right.
It's that something new is happening because history is always new, and we have to figure out, how do we remain us while dealing with this?
Totally. And to be clear, like this comes up again and again. New Polity, generally, we're doing political theology, and we're interested in the ways in which there's continuity in the medieval church, especially, and in what Francis has been doing. And it strikes me that the church's theology of custom, which we don't need to, unravel here, does have, it's not a new insight, as it were, that Francis is bringing, the idea that a people are both the same and yet maturing and growing and different, that they are both receiving reality and then also making for themselves laws because they can act as a corporate subject. These ideas are, I think, contained and worked over in Aquinas and in the theology of custom that is in Gratian and precedes him, and it's in Augustine. I mean, it's this idea that what the people do is authoritative. I don't mean just anything that they do is authoritative, but what they do together in peace, the form of life that Christian peoples take spontaneously, is not arbitrary history that we just look on from above and say, oh, that's interesting, they're doing that, and let's just make sure it stays within these laws. It is itself productive of who and what the Christian people are, and even goes to the point where, the famous quote from Aquinas that the custom of peoples judges law. And so what the people are doing has the authority of law, but not by becoming a positive law. Let's not get too metaphysical here.
It's because it's a response to their circumstances.
Right.
They are responding to their circumstances. So if you want to be responding to your circumstances in a living way, you have to look at, well, what are we doing here?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like that.
It's such a Reuben, it's such a basic idea. What you just said there. What are we doing here? And yet I think that was Francis's approach to the church, was to arrive and ask, what are we doing here? Like, what is our custom?
Yeah.
What are we up to? Now, these are weird things to say, it seems to me, for people used to a European mode of the pontificate. And yet that's what we got, was a guy who kind of would say these things, would kind of like he was looking around the room and saying, all right, what's happening here? What's good? What can we take?
And I mean, you have to start from what are we doing here? But you don't just stay there, because again, it's not a static thing. It's that you have to be responding to the circumstances that are always changing. But you start from what you are doing, and then you take a step from there. But I'll say two things. One is that one of the big things that goes on at the Second Vatican Council is that the Church explicitly admits at the highest level of teaching authority the existence of historicity. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have obviously it existing in various theologians, even in the modern period, St. John Henry Newman, of course. But this is where the Church takes on board the fact that change does exist in time. and is harmonizing that with the permanence and nature of the church, which in at its fundamental level doesn't change. I mean, this sort of stuff runs back all the way to like Aristotle, obviously. Like, how do you have both change and permanence at the same time? But the Second Vatican Council is the sort of the point in modernity where the church says, we got to wrestle with this historicity thing. And the pontificates that immediately followed the council were concerned largely with a lot of other stuff, because the deck chairs were sliding all over the Titanic. But Francis was very concerned with the historicity of the thing. He just took it totally for granted, partly because of his background. But he makes it impossible to miss. He thinks of the church totally in historical terms. Not, again, as though it's dissolved into just the flow of history, but that it is a thing that exists in relation to circumstances that change, and it has a corporate, unified life that changes and grows. And I think that's one of the permanent contributions of the pontificate. Just his single-mindedness about that makes it unmissable. Whereas I think it had already started to fade into the rearview mirror in many people's consciousness, not I think those of St. John Paul or Benedict, but many people who started fading into the rearview mirror. The second thing I want to say in relation to where are we now, and peoples and all that is in the introduction that he wrote to this book, he says something that struck me, because I edited this book, and so I received the text from the translator, and I'm looking them over. And the very first sentence, he's talking about Romano Guardini, and he says, "This makes me think of the people to which I belong, and which most deeply defines me as a person and as a shepherd, the people of God." Now, I read that and thought, defines me as a shepherd? That's a weird phrase. Defines me as a person, we know what that means. Defines me as a shepherd, what's that? So, of course, I thought, well, in Spanish, the word is pastor. So maybe this was a translation mistake. Maybe it should say, defines me as a pastor. But after thinking about it, I realized this was a really good decision on the translator's part, because there is a long tradition. It's in Plato, right? Talking about the ruler as the shepherd of the people. And I think what he's getting at here is that the nature of ruling is in, on the one hand, keeping the flock together and keeping them together as they move and guiding them as they move.
Wow, yeah.
And I think this is fundamental to the way Francis perceived the church and the role of pastors in the church. There's a lot one could say about that. But one thing is that the unity of the church is not, as we so frequently hear, just a sort of ahistorical, like, do we share the key principles? What is it? In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, what is it? Diversity. In all things, charity. People say that. And obviously there's something to that, but the unity of the church consists in doing the same thing. Not like one and the same numerically. We've all got one job, we've all got one hammer, we're all hammering the same nail. But, a body, when it acts toward a goal, all of the parts of the body do different things, but they all act toward the same goal.
Right.
And if the necessity of the action changes with the circumstances of history, all the parts of the church, it can't just be like, we share principles, we apply principles, but we're moving in different directions.
Right.
You keep the flock on the path as it moves.
Yeah.
You shepherd it. So,
yeah.
I'll move on to a third point. So we've talked about social unity and the division in Argentina, and we've talked about people. The third thing I would say is very closely related to what I was just saying, is that he was a spiritual director. He was a Jesuit. Jesuits are spiritual directors, and he was also a spiritual director. And I think that very deeply formed the way he thought about the church. There are a couple things one can say about. Let me pull out my notes here to make sure I say the things I thought about saying. So spiritual directors are first of all concerned with interiority. They're not concerned with intellectual principles. Not as though intellectual principles don't exist and aren't important, but they're concerned with what's actually going on in you, and are you actually paying attention to it? Because you can have correct principles, but hold them in an abstract, unliving way, and then sort of leverage them against what's really going on in you. All of us have seen this with somebody we've been talking to. He's trying to make a life decision, and he's got an idea, and the idea might be like true in some circumstances, but we can all tell that he's using that to avoid doing what he knows he should do. I will not give particular examples on the internet in perpetuity, but I think it's not too hard to imagine. So first of all, is this focus on interiority, like the way the principles actually do exist in your real being. And then there's the movement of the spirits, the spirits, the Jesuit thing of what's going on in you. And then what is the next step? A spiritual director is not concerned with where you should end up after 40 years. He's not even concerned with your 5-year plan or your, where do you want to see yourself in a year? That's a therapist thing. A spiritual director thing is very frequently, what is the next step? What does your conscience tell you should be doing now? Because when you do that, you will find what you should be doing after that. And I mean, you don't just forget the future, right? You factor the future in when you figure out what you should be doing now, but it's about the next thing. Because the conclusion will come.
Right.
Like where you're supposed to end up over time, you'll get there, and you'll get there in a way which is real and living for you and is what God actually wants, as opposed to just layering the idea on.
That's right.
And so I think that really ramified into the way he thought of shepherding the flock on the path as it goes.
Yeah.
It was very much, what are we actually doing here? Is this spiritually good? Not can we pull out principles to justify it, but like, is your heart actually in the right place? And what should you do now? A lot of the stuff he did, and synodality and whatever, you could make a list. People were just kind of racking their brains and breaking their heads trying to figure out what is his ideal of the church. Right. And I don't know that he had one.
Totally. I think that's totally right.
He wasn't trying to, take a crowbar and just force the church into his desired shape. It was like, well, what's the next thing?
He
didn't care if it was incoherent at a certain level, because it's like, life is messy.
This is part of the weakness and sort of beigeness of all of these analyses of Francis's pontificate, is that they either assert or look for a ideal schema that he must have had and he must have been trying to implement, so from one constitution to another, and he either succeeded or failed according to the analysis of the journalist. I'm sorry, theologian, maybe. And this is just nowhere brought to evidence. Like there's no, that idea that the theology of the people is somehow liberation theology light itself is such a misunderstanding, because it structurally conceives of where Pope Francis was coming from as some schema that was all laid out, by someone. Yeah. And then, look, he was trying to implement it.
Yeah, we had the St. Gallen Mafia, and they had their plan. They're just running the plan.
Yeah, running the plan. But it's ridiculous for so many reasons. One is that it was obvious in the reception in just what Pope Francis did day to day, that it appeared, if it was the application of some unified schema that was thought in advance and which was sort of destined to be the sort of form that the ideal church would take, that he wasn't good at doing that at all, because every day brought something totally new.
Yeah.
So either the schema is insane, or there's not a schema. So, for instance, you saw this with the conservative...
Or he was some Machiavellian spider who was trying to, like, look left and dodge right.
I know, it's ridiculous.
And it just doesn't match any experience of the man.
It's, you know, it's television brain, right? Because, like, you watch someone on TV. That's essentially what we do. I mean, it's on the internet, but it's all just TV. And you unify the guy in your head, right? But then, because you're getting these sort of impressions, and reason longs for unity out of a multiplicity, of course. But then you meet the guy, you know, like people do this even with me on a silly little podcast that gets under 1,000 views per video. They're like, oh, so you have this unified life schema, Mark, I've been watching, and I know that you do these things because you're enacting a philosophy. I don't really get the philosophy yet, but I know it's there. And I'm like, man, I'm just waking up in the morning, and probably more than most people in some ways, but I'm just waking up, you know, and figuring out like what the 2-year-old is crying about, you know? And I think this is actually, I'm not just trying to like make myself an example of a character type, because I think this is actually just how life works. Like anyone who is implementing a schema as the form of their life is a sociopath and to be avoided. And so the idea that we thought this of the Pope is, I think, a sin against charity from the beginning. That we're like, here's a scheming guy with a backpack of plans that he's about to lay down through his power plays. It's like, what the heck? Is he a like 19-year-old DC intern? No, this is an old man. He's not anyways. I'm trying to say something in particular, not just be upset on the internet. Namely, Reuben.
Bring it on home.
Yeah. That, you know, when he would seemingly flip-flop on positions, like we brought this sort of view to him where he would say, you know, something about you know, we're going to wash the feet of the Muslim, right? And then you know, we're going to talk about how there seems to be some homosexuality in the church that really needs to be cleared out. And then he would say, you know, we should bless these couples because we're blessing the couple. And then he would say, you know, like when you tried to pin him down, and then he'd say, having an abortion is like hiring a hitman to kill someone. Like, you know, he would never, and we've certainly heard it said by many people that he would never, well, he doesn't fit into the categories, right? This is like, this is the way of condemning the Pope with light praise. That's
faint praise.
Faint praise, that's the word. You know, so on that side, you'd have this like, look how intricate the church's sort of tower of doctrine is, that when someone's living it out, it's like, ooh, this, now that, now this, now that, now this. So that was like the praise that made him just, I mean, essentially it was like the church as a complicated rule book. And then you had the kind of just bafflement, I think, on the other side, which was like, but I thought he was doing this leftist liberation theology thing, and now here he is. So I just won't talk about the times that he says pro-life things, and you know,
the times when he says the things that make my interpretation hard.
Yeah, but all of which is to say that there's another interpretation of this lack of interpretation, which is just exactly what you have said, that shepherding itself involves a relationship to a flock that is moving forward in time and who's always facing what's now and what's new.
And sometimes you make mistakes. You look at it and you go, I think this is the direction we take. And you try that and you go, that's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you do something different.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the sort of things we're saying here explain a lot of stuff about his pontificate that some of it led to bafflement, some of it led to false interpretation, some of it just wasn't noticed. I mean, one thing, let's get a little controversial. Traditionis Custodes, the reversal of Benedict's motu proprio, liberalizing, if I can use that word, the permissions for the prior form of the Roman Rite. People read that as he's opposing Benedict. He thinks Benedict is wrong. He's overturning Benedict's big accomplishment. If you read Benedict's document accompanying Summorum Pontificum, when he gives reasons for what he's doing, he says, people are saying, here's one reason we shouldn't do this. People are saying, here's another reason we shouldn't do this. Now, Benedict says, I think neither of those things are going to happen. Those bad consequences will not occur. Of course, he goes on to say, if they do, we can look at this again in a few years and revisit.
Mm-hmm.
And then Francis, a few years later, looks at it and revisits. And people go, he's doing something different than Benedict. So, well, no, he's revisiting.
Mm-hmm.
He can hold the position. It's entirely coherent to say Benedict did the right thing then. Mm-hmm. It needed to happen then. And in certain ways, it did not have good effects. So we're going to change what we're doing to try to help the effects. And there's nothing incoherent about this at all.
Yeah.
Some other things that people didn't notice. So moving from the controversial to the non-controversial, maybe be a little controversial. The phrase everyone associates with him. You know, people associate John Paul with "be not afraid," and I don't know that Benedict had a phrase. But Francis, people associate him with Hagan Leo, notoriously hard to translate. Make some noise, shake things up, make a mess is the usual one. And people loved that translation. Make a mess. This is what Francis did. He was just making a mess. Okay, we'll leave Hagan Leo to one side. The phrase he actually used the most, by far, it happened almost every time he spoke. And I'm not kidding. Almost every time he spoke was, the Italian is avanti, the Spanish is adelante. It just means forward, move on, the next thing. And it's the spiritual director. It's the shepherd. It's like, do what's here now. In his first major interview published under the name, I think, A Big Heart Open to God, he talks about the normal Christians as part of the great, he calls it the middle class of holiness, where you're just doing daily life. You're waking up and figuring out what the 2-year-old is crying about. Yeah. And he says that holiness for him, he thinks of it as patience, dealing with moment by moment the thing in front of you and continuing to move forward, to do the next thing, to go on. And
there's such a great,
that's the statement he made again and again. Avanti, avanti, do it. Just do the next thing. Let God take care of it. Yeah,
this might be too interpretive, I guess. But it seems to me that Pope Francis had a lot of faith in the reality of God, which as a pope, I guess you'd hope for, right? But I think Americans are especially prone to not actually believe in God. And don't get me wrong, I'm not just trying to like rip on my people here. I just mean, I mean that it's hard for me not to just propositionally believe in God, but to do these sorts of things that one who believes in God would actually do. And for that to be a coherence and not a sort of extrinsic, like, I'm going to pretend that God's real. Yeah. No, like you do, and you act like it.
And not just to mentally believe in God. No. But like to organically, livingly.
The things you do because
from
God's
belief
real.
In God.
Yeah. So I think, and this is one of the ways that I think this is so obvious. Like he is the anti-atheist pope in the sense that his trust that we can just move forward because all of the grace is real, that we can make the mistake and move on, seems to only be possible if you're not worried that the thing is really a human construction.
Because it's going to fail.
If it's a human construction, you can really screw it up. And then it's done. It's over.
People are not used to the Pope believing in the infallibility of the Pope. That's one way of putting it.
I've noticed.
It's like, well, here I am. We're doing it. And God's going to sort it out.
I think that's right.
You do what you think God asks, and it doesn't have to make sense to you.
I think that's right. And I think he kind of lives. And again, I'm going back to this idea of what the theology of the people meant to him in Argentina was the idea that the power of God is not just an intellectual idea, but it is real peace among enemies. It is a social miracle that could not have come from human sort of devising. And I think this also helps to explain the emphasis on mercy and patience, like you said, but also what got considered as just like softness, I guess, in terms of what he was like the effective attitude of the church towards the world.
The field hospital.
The tenderness, the feminine images, the maternal images that he would use, hardly outside of the Catholic tradition, obviously. But I think we should pause on that for a moment, because one of the things you'll notice that people do when they're not sure of something is they will work harder to shore the thing up, right? So if you're worried your marriage is falling apart, right, and you're actually worried about it, and you don't have this just abiding trust in the love of the other, then you'll see if you're not just like, giving up and going to Mexico or whatever. That's not a good. I meant like in a dissipated way where you're drinking tequila. Thank you. If that's the case, then you're going to start working, and you're going to start implementing plans, and you're going to start thinking like, okay, we got to set some boundaries and rules here, and if this happens, I have to do that. And you start making sort of and that's, in some ways, that's what you should do, because the idea that you can just get up and go is precisely what's at odds. I mean, if you see a child who has, it's one of the saddest things in the world, if they have some kind of relationship of fear with their parent, then all of a sudden...
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but
please.
I think that you've touched on something, which is that we, almost all of us, at this point in history, are concerned about the church.
Yeah.
Like we think that it might fail.
Totally.
Which is just not faith.
No, but
and so we're concerned about the shoring up, and he was concerned about the doing the thing.
And this is the point of analysis that I was worried that might be too interpretive, but I want to think a little bit about Latin America and America in this regard. So America, North America, and Europe, broadly considered, are heirs to what Rocco in this book calls the Enlightenment modernity. And in the same book, he contrasts this to what he calls a Catholic modernity. And this is a historical split that comes from the simple historical reality that the New World is new and was discovered new. So all the stuff we were going through wasn't happening there.
It was not.
So
very different things were
happening. But one of the differences seems to me evident in what you might call secularism, right? Because if you just take Europe's experience of the world as it's kind of been given to us, then we experience a trend of secularism. So and by this I just mean the loss of the church, and it's been going on for a while. We can blame Protestants somewhat, but we got to blame absolutist Catholics alongside. I mean, there's just like this mess of history, but it produces this very tangible result, which is that over time, you can basically bet, and in fact, I think pastors even in the church today in our country bet on losing.
Yep.
We're going to lose members. Everyone's going to get old. Your parish is just going to pretty much die out unless you have some oddity thing you do, and then it might revive itself, but it'll be an anomaly. And we're going to lose the faith, and the faith will be liberalized by generation to generation. And when there is a resurgence, it'll be sort of a reactionary resurgence, because the thing itself, the history itself, is a process of secularization. And so then when we think, well, what's the church at the end of the day? All we can imagine is a remnant that is left over after an inevitable historical process, in which the church, even as we take some kind of glory in like, yes, but the remnant is so faithful and purified, what we're basically saying is we failed and the world was lost. Right? Like the church as power, as people acting and able to act powerfully is just not even on our radar, which is, I think, what offends people so much about integralism in these debates. I'm going to say something nice about the integralists, which is that if nothing else,
this podcast will make everyone happy.
I'm here for your happiness. I mean, this is entertainment, right? No, but one of the scandals that it brings to bear is because they are just almost asserting, without much of a reason to assert, success, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying, like, let's just forget what the form of the success is and if it's good or bad. I'm just saying, at the end of the day, what an integralist minded person does to shock all of the other players in the theological field is he asserts the success of the church. No, actually, we're going to be really powerful. And actually, we're going to do things that mean that we can act and be glorious and triumphant. Okay.
Yeah.
All of that being said, that's just the sort of reactionary mode that secularism seems
We're going to do it from above and with power.
Right, exactly. It brings up in the church. Like, given that we can only assume secularism, then the church herself, as the receptive one, as the one who receives the power of Christ in the world, has to be sort of supplemented by, human mechanisms, because secularism, all right, that's the sort of Western experience. And it's become very bitter and sad. The Latin American experience is not that. And it hasn't been that. And of course, there's secularization, don't get me wrong, especially Pope
now.
Francis in the introduction. I think in some ways we are talking about a reality that perhaps has fallen. I don't know yet. I think only time will tell whether...
Yeah, you should read some of his speeches when he was Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He refers to Buenos Aires as a pagan society.
And there is this way in which the cities, especially as they became sort of outposts of Western consumerism, which is what a city largely was.
It's a port.
It was a port, yeah. Became, I think... there's lots of ways to think about this, but it became in some ways secular precisely to the extent that it became like the North American city, basically consumeristic, high technology, and hedonistic. I sound like a Puritan, but the cities. Okay, but there persisted in Latin America and still does this this hope that didn't have inevitable secularization as its endpoint. And part of this was because of the Guadalupe event, the very constitution of the people being informed by the revelation of Christ and of Our Lady.
Right, what the Latin American people is, the thing that brings them together, was Guadalupe.
Yeah. And I want to touch on that more, but I just want to finish this particular thought. So that expresses itself in a piety among the people that isn't extrinsic to who they are, right? But is a memory of them in their deep origins, right? Because the Guadalupe event is real and constitutes what it means to be a part of this people, then going to that shrine, going on that pilgrimage, going on your knees before the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is not something that just can fade over time without Latin America itself fading over time. There is a weaving together of people and Christ that we have in Europe, but especially in America, we've sort of declared, we've acted like it didn't happen. I want to read something that Pope Francis says, where he says that in this introduction to this book, he says, Buttiglione keenly observes that the many forms of religiosity in Latin America are putting up resistance to a secularized understanding of social life and of history. This is one of many signs that Latin America has a unique social and cultural dynamic, which cannot be thoroughly explained using models of social interpretation fashioned for other places. Thus, theories of secularization and the theologies in various ways inspired by them find in popular piety a counterexample, which should contribute to their being corrected and reformulated. So not just secularism being corrected, but the theologies that presume secularism as inevitable themselves are corrected by the popular piety of Latin America, or rather, ought to be. This helps us to explain, to a degree, the pastoral failure of liberation theology, which the Pope is supposed to be preaching, but here he goes. If Marxism were true, he says, it should be accompanied by a process of growing secularization. And he says, I don't see it. In reality, however, the poor of Latin America very often live their suffering and exclusion out of a remarkable experience of spiritual things, which gives them hope and motivates them to live as brothers, to fight for justice, especially in grave situations and emergencies. Okay. So you see, the Pope is not saying it's a golden place where we don't have any problems at all. He's saying when the rubber hits the road, we turn to Mary. And when the emergency happens, we are a people of faith. That's the presumption.
Yeah, deep
when the rubber
down,
hits the
what
road,
makes us us.
Yeah, when the rubber hits the road in America, what do you turn to? In North America, is it the case that at times of national emergency, the people in the suburbs of Cincinnati are going to Mary and on their knees? Now, maybe they are, but it seems to me that what we actually do is we hug our money tight. Like when the emergency happens, so it's an inverse in a way, right? So like we can see a lot of secularism in Latin America. We can see this is true. There's a lot of problems, but what the Pope is saying is, look, I know my people, and when the rubber hits the road, they're on their knees before Our Lady. And it's messy and it's weird, but that's who we are. It's what we do.
Yeah, and there may even be a certain amount of superstition.
Oh,
whatever,
absolutely.
But it's something you can work with.
Yeah.
Like they know.
And then I'm saying that I know my people. And I know that the inverse seems to be the case, which is that, we will talk about God and we will believe in his name and we will be proudly the most religious country. And if you look at the statistics, more Americans believe in God than anywhere in Europe. That's our people. But when the rubber hits the road, we don't go to church to pray in Eucharistic adoration. We try to make sure we have enough money to avoid the situation. We try to as it were use the means of man, I think, when there's
if I may
major
turn
problems.
a corner here and go back to the distinction between principles and the movement of the spirits, to say something different about it. There's one way of thinking about the church is that you've got principles and you act from principles. We've got the abstract. Oh man, I heard someone saying this the other day that the Pope's job is to sort of enunciate the high level principles, and not to tell us what to do with particular situations and make prudential decisions, which is just observably false. But that's one version of it, where the church's unity is constituted by, at the high level, abstract level, we got the same ideas, and then we work through them and we do stuff. Mm-hmm. And the other one is, that God exists, that there is such a thing as spirituality, that there is a movement of the Holy Spirit in me. And this is not, it's not a dichotomy. Obviously, principles exist, but the difference is this. So, Aquinas talks about this. As he puts it in his very Thomist way, if man has an end which is purely natural, then his purely natural powers can direct him to the end. Mm-hmm. He can use his reason as his reason to figure out what to do and to do it. And that's fine. Because it's a purely natural end, he understands it with his powers, he does something about it. But if man has an end that exceeds his nature, then man must be directed to the end by something that is above his nature. I think this is in case people want to check me on this, I believe it's the Summa Prima Secunda, question 68, article 2. It's one of the places he talks about it. At any rate, it's all over. Mm-hmm. So what this means is you need the Holy Spirit. God is not a principle. God is real. Jesus Christ is not a principle. He's a person. The Holy Spirit is not a principle. Principles are a way of representing the truth in terms of the mind, but the mind cannot grasp God. Right. God grasps God. It is the Holy Spirit who searches the depths of God. So if our end is in fact God himself, God's own inner life, only God can direct us to God. Mm-hmm. So the movement of the spirits, as St. Ignatius calls it, becomes something of extraordinary importance because there simply is no Christian life without it. Mm. This is the description of Christianity. Does God actually live in you? Are you actually acting from God and God's guidance? That's the bottom line. And the attempt to simply direct things in terms of principles presupposes that God is not real and he's not in us and we're not heading toward him. Mm-hmm. It presupposes that reason alone suffices. Mm-hmm. It is not to say, again, that principles don't matter. Human beings think. I'm not saying that. but the total reliance on principles, as though you just need to know the rules and stick to the rules and know how to manipulate the stuff, is not what we're doing here. And this, it seems to me, is one of the very important things that about Francis. Obviously, one finds the same emphasis in St. John Paul the Great and Benedict. But in Francis, it takes on this sort of single-mindedness and is moved to the forefront, and where if you don't grasp it, you can't understand him.
Yeah.
And it's a little concerning to me that the result we had was we didn't understand him.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to that worry that we have, that it's not real. And so the idea of someone, I mean, it strikes me that most people didn't like the saints, like when they were actually living. Something about someone who actually believes in just a thoroughgoing way, where their life is a outliving of that belief, is annoying and scary and risky feeling to everyone, because we don't trust. Like, we have unbelief as a problem.
Well, this is precisely what, I mean, I actually get a little angry when I hear people say, oh, Francis wasn't defending the faith, he wasn't strengthening his brothers in the faith. And I know some of the reasons why people say that. But I think almost 100% of the time when they say that, they're thinking of the faith as a series of principles. Mm-hmm. And what they mean is he didn't stand up for this principle or that principle or the other thing. Mm-hmm. But his concern, and again, he's a spiritual director, deep down, his concern was about what I have in a totally unhelpful manner called the faithiness of the faith. Like, he's concerned with, is the faith a living thing? Is it actually listening to the Spirit of God? Because you can get all the principles right. The demons believe and tremble. You can get all of the principles right and not be a Christian.
Right.
And that's what he was defending again and again and again. Is the heart responding to the movement of God, or is it just hauling off and doing stuff that it judges to be good? And that is the difference between Christianity and rationalism. And I mean, he said that again and again. Are you turning the faith into an ideology, into a system of ideas?
Yeah.
Or are you letting the faith be the faith? And if that's not defending the faith, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's maybe not the only thing you got to do, but it is the actual essence of the thing. Is the faith communion with God, contact with God, or not?
Yeah.
And I think deep down, all of us, and I will include me in this, not all of us, most of us, and I will include myself in this, think it is not.
Sure.
We like just hauling off and doing things, judging by our own ideas and our principles, and then we say, he's demanding uniformity in the church, instead of, are you on the path? We're all here. We're all dealing with the circumstances as they come up. Yeah. Are you doing that, or are you just operating from your autonomous idea, heading some other direction?
Yeah. One of the ways we started this, I realized I had the feeling you get when you Control C something and then you forget what it is, but you still have to paste something.
Yeah.
Command C, Command V. But then I recall that we started this with, or at least I kind of started some of this line of thought with a discussion of the Pope's emphasis on mercy.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And tenderness, and it being kind of interpreted as a sort of limp-wristed softness, that what we really need is we need the firm church, church who lays down the strict rules and has expectations. Yeah, a headline I saw promoting a particular cardinal to the new papacy defined it as the anti-woke Pope that the church needs, and I thought, yeah, it's probably going to be one of the factions in that conclave. But that mercy, that emphasis on tenderness, is similarly, it comes from this trust in the reality of God and his life in his people. You can be merciful and tender when you're not worried. So an example that I always like to use, that I think also places Francis in our European history a little bit, is Charlemagne and Alcuin, one of the greatest relationships to ever. You've been reading a lot about that. Well, they got a lot of extant letters.
Now you just bring it up like it's a thing we all know about.
Charlemagne and Alcuin. So Alcuin's a deacon, blessed Alcuin, I should say, of York, and he's in Charlemagne's court. And of course, the two are involved in what then sort of post facto gets called the Carolingian Reformation or Renaissance sometimes. But it really was an effort at reforming the church that Charlemagne was deeply concerned with as a believing Catholic. Not as a sort of just political player, and Alcuin is a canon regular. I forget how these things go.
No one knows what it means anyway.
But anyways, he's a man with holy orders, and of course he also has this great concern for they're doing so much. They've just established this sort of definitive and self-conscious Christian empire, and they are reforming the liturgy. They are destroying other rites and unifying. They are making sure everyone knows how to get the Psalms right and to stop mispronouncing Latin. I mean, they are just after people. They are demanding that godparents teach their godchildren the Creed and the Our Father. At the very least, you've got these great stories of Charlemagne showing up.
What were they doing?
There is this parallel where there was this the people sent deliberately to figure out, okay, we've unified all these different peoples and we're this Christian thing. What are we doing? Is it good? Let's go out and find out. Whoa, that's not good. That's magic. Let's stop doing that thing. And it was just this actual effort of reform. Okay, so this is the sort of...
one of the answers you get when you ask the question, what are we doing here? You go, we're doing that.
Oh, no, yeah. I never should have asked. And so it is a parallel to our situation in that there is many reasons to be concerned. I mean, it's, we're concerned that the kids are, just care about TikTok and don't want to go to church. I mean, they're talking about sacrificing goats to druids and such. It's like, there was... Okay, actually, druids, that's not contemporary. Sorry. The Saxons were ostensibly doing other things.
I was thinking about
it. Okay. Alcuin is advising Charlemagne. He's definitely got his hand in writing a lot of the capitularies, the sort of laws and their promulgation that Charlemagne is making for this new empire. And Charlemagne's kind of a rigorous guy. And I think it makes sense because he just conquered people. Like they fought wars, and now these people are all being baptized, and he wants to give them laws, and he wants to ensure that they follow them because he just fought these people and he does not trust them, right? We don't have to ask what his trust in Christ was. He seems like he just seems to be a great Catholic guy, as far as I can tell. Just like me, Charlemagne.
Wait.
But he's there, and he's saying things like, proposing things like, all right, anyone who does not keep the great fast with us, death penalty.
Whoa.
And he's saying things like, the first thing we need to make sure...
You're going to have to experience Easter in your own fashion. Yeah.
First thing we need to make sure of these newly conquered people who are becoming Christians is that they pay the tithe. Right? That was a big thing. And it's Alcuin who's looking at this and saying, no. Don't make them pay the tithe. Give them milk, not meat. So give them tenderness, feminine warmth. Give them he often says, the joy of the faith.
Evangelii Gaudium.
If we're going to preach to them, let us preach the good and sweet things of Christianity, he says, so that they will know they are saved, that they are freed from the fear they have of the powers, the dark powers and demons that surrounded them and became a basis of their unity. So they no longer have to be afraid. Preach them that. Preach them that, and then they will pay the tithe, and they'll do it lovingly and willingly. But if you begin with the tithe, right, they're going to think, essentially, that this is just another form of subjugation.
Yeah.
Right? We're subject to the church now. We were subject to the powers before. Alcuin influenced Charlemagne, and he really did change laws. So he actually took the advice and moved towards tenderness. So I don't set them up as an idea of like two ways before you, the Alcuin road or the Charlemagne road, because in fact, that was the lay temporal power in relation to the spiritual power.
Charlemagne took it in.
Yeah, and he also pushed back on Alcuin. I mean, he often, there's felt that Alcuin was being too sort of limp-wristed about things and letting prisoners get free sanctuary when instead of pursuing the king's justice.
But he didn't have the 1970s to blame it on. You couldn't say, Alcuin, you warmed over hippie.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. Absolutely not. But what you see is in the church, this dynamic where the focus on tenderness is made possible by faith. And not the focus on tenderness, but real tenderness. Like the idea that I have something.
By focus, you mean the foregrounding, the fact that it's the thing you lead with, and you're actually able to lead with it.
Alcuin's not saying don't pay the tithe. He's not saying don't keep the fast. He's saying that Christianity is fundamentally good and sweet and freeing.
So you lead with the goodness.
And liberating. And you can lead with it because you can trust it, because it's real. And so
in fact, you have to lead with it because that's what it is.
Right.
It is good.
Yeah.
If you lead with the rules, as I say, you know, people will think it's just another system of rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's not. It is real life. It is the human heart waking up again.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that even this can be read, unfortunately, as this sort of like scheming thing. It's like, well, we're going to get the hard stuff by, Yeah,
it's this Foucault, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of creeping into the soul with all of these sweet things, and then eventually you're a prisoner of the church again. And look, at some level, you can't answer the suspicions of atheists, right? Because the definition of suspicion is that you tell them the truth and they suspect it, right?
Right.
But Christianity is good, and it's sweet, and it makes life sweet.
Well, and this is something that Francis said over and over again. It's one of the other things he said almost every time he spoke. The style of God. He talked about the style of God. And what is God's style? It is closeness, he said. It's closeness, compassion, and tenderness. The style of God. Do not do anything without the style of God.
Wow.
And just again and again and again, he'd said it, and we didn't, you notice, because it just seemed trite. And but yeah, he was convinced that you don't just lead with this because it's nice or it's good right now, although it may be especially needed right now. It's because this is actually how God acts. Mm-hmm. God comes down to man. He becomes man. He becomes close, and he is merciful with the sinner. He doesn't throw him around, beat him back and forth, but he comes down to the lost sheep, takes him on his shoulders. Closeness, compassion, tenderness. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, what you're saying is that this is not new in the church. This is.
And this doesn't like somehow negate sternness or firmness or any of these sort of aesthetic values that we have which correspond with sin, in the sense that where there is still sin, where there is still rebellion and resistance, then obviously, the wicked need to be coerced into impotence, and the devil needs to be confused and cast out, and all of these things are true.
And meeting people where they are sometimes means telling them they know they're doing the wrong thing.
Oh, and he would do this all the time. I was just reading this story about him. It was somewhat humorous because he was telling the guy in a language that he didn't understand. I think he was probably an Italian. I don't know what the other guy was speaking, but just telling him to get your legs out from the aisle. You're at mass. Like, you need, your body is not. No, Francis.
Oh, Francis.
I'm sure Charlemagne. I
was confused.
Sorry, I know Charlemagne said this to many people. He would interrupt liturgies if he felt like someone was being irreverent, which seems a little irreverent in some ways. But yeah, I wasn't there. But no. This is just an anecdote of Francis just calling people out, like, directly in homilies for the irreverence of their posture during the liturgy. And
I want to see that. Send that to me.
Yeah, I will. So there's no, and obviously one of the things traditionalists complained of, and I think we're right about, is a certain sternness to Francis that seemed like harsh and unyielding. And I think that's real. That was part of who he was too. And I can't say whether, it's because he was perfectly consistent. Where there was sin, he was harsh. Where there was virtue, he was tender.
Who knows?
I don't know. But I do know that Christianity has both, because it is a dynamic dealing with reality that is good and sweet, and then also destroys sin. Like, this is all true.
And I can't say for Francis that the two of the things where he became harsh, maybe there are more, are perfectly consistent with the sort of things we're discussing. One of them is what he called the elite. Mm-hmm. So you have the people that it's a interior belonging. They're all doing the same thing. And there's the elite, which, as he says at one point, I wrote it down because I wanted to be sure to get it right. When I speak of elite, I do not mean a social class. I speak of an attitude of the soul. Mm-hmm. So, we hear elite and we think, it's a sociological term. And there's quite a lot on that in Buttiglione's book, which is where I first noticed it. And then I started seeing it when I read Francis and came across his own definition here. It has to do with not with like having a higher degree of education of other people or a higher degree of power or whatever. It has to do with, as he says, being without roots in a people, without connection with a historical people, thinking that you're above that. So it goes back to the principles again. Like, I'm just acting from principles. I don't have to be part of the historical life of the thing. Right. And so he would be harsh with that. He'd say, that's not Christianity. That's not even humanity. We're all part of a people. Get off your spiritualistic monad cloud and go back.
Yeah.
Go back to the people.
Which is such a critique of our implicit liberalism. Like, that is how we view ourselves. So very often I think Francis revealed ourselves to ourselves in a lot of ways as people who do kind of view ourselves as not having to be of a people. I mean, one way that this is obvious is in our misunderstanding of what he meant by accompaniment.
Yes.
Where we thought, it seems to me, if I can be general here, that he meant something like, from a position of aboveness, of power, I as Pope tell you to go and meet the poor and the marginalized at the periphery where they're at. And accompany them, as opposed to preach to them, convert them. And that was where
as though it's a lowest common denominator thing. Right. Rushing to the bottom.
Lower yourself, and then just sort of, and so the image I would get, because this is Steubenville, or I'm from Steubenville, is that this means that I find the guy who's on opioids, and I sit next to him and I just listen.
Or even worse, you start taking drugs too, so he knows you're one of them.
That would be the extreme. But I at least contort my face in such a way that I'm just like, whatever you say and whoever you are, I'm just this receptive vacuum in the universe, and you can pour yourself sort of into this, and don't worry, nothing will happen. Right? Okay, so that's sort of the extreme. I think fear.
Just be there with them.
But accompaniment doesn't come from a place of authority down. It's very clear if you look at it comes out in this book. If you look at Pope Francis, he thinks that the customs of the people, especially as expressed in the poor, who are living somewhat naively, and so have a certain intensification of custom, which is totally traditional. Traditional view of the poor is that that's sort of where you get to know what a people are up to, because there's less extrinsic planning. Think about, just let's be very basic. A poor person is someone that doesn't have a lot of means. And because of this, they, in a very obvious way, have to take life as it comes, because they cannot manipulate levers and money and property and people in order to bring to bear some idiosyncratic custom. In fact, they just have to sort of take, the point there is that makes the poor an authority for a Christian. Why? Because they have a particular way of life that is receiving reality and living it as a Christian people. both as a people, but also as the people of God. When you accompany them, you're actually, insofar as you are learning what they're up to and how they're responding, you are going as one who is beneath them up to an authority within Christian society, which I would just call the authority of custom. Okay, let me back up because I can see from your face that you're confused.
I'm confused. Yeah, where are we going with this?
Well, what I mean is, so maybe this would make more obvious. For Francis, he has a very particular image in mind, which is Marian devotion in Latin America.
Yeah.
If you want to know something about the poor, it's that they love Mary, right? And when someone accompanies the poor, you're going to find out that they love Mary.
Yeah.
And this finding out, he says specifically in his introduction, this will be confusing to elites, this Marian piety, right? And he means elites in the clerical, in the priesthood as well as in the laity.
Yeah. He means elites in the attitude of soul.
The attitude of soul. And what's confusing? Well, it's confusing for what we mentioned, which is that it seems to oppose the sort of natural process of secularization. And he also seems to be concerned that they will take it as something stupid or silly. Like, oh yes, they have this thing. I don't take it as a authority that teaches me.
Yeah.
I take it as something that they're up to. And so we thought of accompaniment in this way, that you come down and you see the kind of silly thing that the lower class, the poor person is doing, and you just are sort of nice to him, right? And that seems lame compared to the full-throated Christianity that we're all after here. But I don't think that's what the Pope meant at all. I thought he meant go to your teacher, because it's a genuine source of authority and teaching in the church is the customs
there's
of the Christian people.
I think that's more what he meant by the smell of the sheep, right? That the pastor guides the flock, but the whole flock is moving, and he's got to keep them on the way. Sorry, and he the whole flock is moving. He's got to keep them on the way and make sure they're not straying off into crazy stuff.
Yeah, of course.
But at the same time, the whole flock is on the way, and the pastor doesn't like learn it from his ideas. He's not working with principles and applying them. Right. And he doesn't have a hotline to God. It's not like, I hear from the Holy Spirit and they don't.
Yeah, right.
Now, you may hear in different ways, especially as you have different levels of intelligence and education, and you're working in different fields and all that. But the whole people of God is Christian.
Right.
And so it's the necessity of not the pastor has to root himself in the people, but he also has to speak to them from a position above. And I think by accompaniment, he meant much more something like he says with Avanti. All the time he'd be saying that. And the accompaniment is not sit there passively next to him and say, oh yeah, it must be hard. Mm-hmm. And it's not a rush to the bottom. It's the spiritual director thing. Come to them and figure out, what do you need to do? What do you need to do? Right. Now do it. Don't not do it. Mm-hmm. Don't just sit there. You will never improve unless you move. And so you have to take the next step. And is it going to be messy? Is it going to be imperfect?
Sure.
Yeah, certainly for now, but do it as opposed to just like sitting on high and throwing down principles at them.
Yeah.
Here's the fullness of the Christian life.
Yeah.
No, the purpose of the pastor is to help the people as a whole and the people in terms of like individuals grow step by step. And that involves accompanying. You have to be close to them. You have to know on the one hand where they are and what's good in it and root yourself in that. On the other hand, where they are and what's bad in it, and also what it seems God is saying to them to do. Yeah.
Well, we should probably wrap it up.
We should start wrapping it up. I think that a good concluding image here, and maybe Alex can actually put a picture of this up because it would help to see it. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with his pectoral cross. Mm-hmm. And I am ashamed to say that I only understood it yesterday. Mm-hmm. I spent years and years looking at it and going, that's just kind of sentimental, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's the cross, and it's got the figure of Jesus with a sheep over his shoulders, and then in the arms of the cross there are the sheep kind of surrounding him. There's the Holy Spirit at the top, and it's like, well, it's a cross, but it's not a crucifix. That's a little odd, and it just seemed like, it's nice and pastoral, and I don't mean that in the church sense. I mean it in the like English literature sense.
Right.
Of it, if it's just sentimental and it's kind of like nice and fluffy, and that's really what I thought about it for years. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I prefer the kinds of pectoral crosses the other popes would wear, and only yesterday to look at it and get it. And I'm embarrassed by this because, especially after having read this book, it should have been obvious to me what's going on here. And I now think it's just a really wonderful piece of art. It contains in itself an entire theology and spirituality, and quite a lot of what Francis was saying and doing, and the permanent thing he has given to the church. Well, one, it's the emphasis on the shepherd. The shepherd is with the flock, going somewhere and guiding it. And if you look at it, you can see that like Christ is at the forefront of this, moving forward, and the sheep on the arms are pressing in toward Christ. They're not just wandering out; they're all moving in one direction toward Christ, who's at the front. And then you have the Holy Spirit at the top, and these sort of lines down the whole back of the cross. They look like rushing. It's just rushing movement lines. And there are two things going on, it seems, that they mean at once. And one is that the flock is moving. It's not just Christ is standing here in front of a flock. No, he's walking. The flock is moving. And the other thing is that the movement seems to be coming from the Holy Spirit and then moving through the whole people with Christ at its head. And Christ is carrying the one strayed lamb, leaves the 99 to go get the one. But what does he do? He makes it part of the flock, carries it on his shoulders. And he's leading with the strayed lamb on his shoulders. Like, what is the direction we are all going? Toward those who need the church. And overall, the whole thing is in the shape of a cross. Because how does Christ pursue the strayed lamb? It's through the cross, going down to where the sheep is and getting it. Death and hell.
Yeah.
And this is what Francis chose to wear. He had it designed, I don't know when, way back. He had it in Argentina. And kept it as Pope. And it seems to me that one image encapsulates his sense of the church, of being a pastor in the church. And it's just all there. And he wore it on his chest for 12 years, and it wasn't until yesterday I understood it.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And it is a fitting sign. And also a difficult one, I think, for us. I think if there's, Pope Francis, like we said at the beginning of this, will still be teaching his church for time immemorial, or until the end of time. That's the word. So saying like, well, here's what I'm one of the frustrating parts of these sort of retrospectives that are so immediate to hand when a pope dies is they kind of give you this line of like, well, here's what to take from the papacy, but here's what I take from the papacy. The decision, no, it's not a decision. The willingness to let God lead you is extremely hard. And the temptation to reimagine God's life in you as ideological, as a ultimately man-made, even if God derived list of rules, system that just needs to be implemented. It's a perennial temptation. It's an understandable temptation, But I think it is the great challenge that the post-Enlightenment European Catholic has. Because, I mean, for a whole multitude of reasons, but I think in part because of the individualism of his culture and his climate, he's always lacking, as it were, the confirmation of the reality of his faith as something that a people is doing together, because he always is being told by another voice, which is not the voice of Christ, that you are alone. You are an individual, and anything you do is that seems social is really just some form of the individual as it takes on a certain belief, takes on a certain characteristic, identifies with a church, etc., etc. That is the struggle in the soul, I think, of us. But Pope Francis, I think, teaches us by way of example is that the way of fighting that sort of tendency has to be through the cross, and it has to be a willingness to receive the grace of Christ, to be once again and continuously incorporated into a people. That we are in some ways the recipients of that Old Testament curse, namely that you are not a people. This is how God describes like the utter devastation of Israel is by saying, I will say to you, you are no people. Sometimes we translate it like that. I think in some ways the culture that we've inherited is the sense of
the
like,
Enlightenment.
You don't belong
culture.
You just don't belong to anyone, and the terrifying part is that we don't experience it as a devastation, but as a liberation from some kind of
into power, ability to act, and
like you are. And so the humiliating, the easiest thing to do is to try and retain that power of the individual as he's separated out and not really involved in life and in other people as this monadic entity, and to make that thing Catholic and then say, voila. The hardest thing is to convert like all the way down anthropologically. But one of the ways that we can start is by just acknowledging that, I think, and asking God for the help to simply, now I sound like Francis, which I guess makes sense if you're talking about him, but to simply be present before the reality of the grace that's given to you and be a part of the people of God as an attitude. Like, just try to think of yourself as member. I think that's the step that most people have to take is like, do you not know that you are a member of a body? And that the moves you make are with a people.
And in time. With a people moving in time. The motto of the Holy Year, which he started and we're still in, the year of hope, is peregrinantes in spem, and that is usually translated as pilgrims of hope. And even Francis himself would sometimes say pilgrims of hope in Italian. But the actual motto, which it seems to me he came up with, it very clearly bears the mark of his thinking. So if somebody else did it, they understood him pretty well. He was fluent in Latin, so I expect he wrote it. Peregrinantes in spem does not mean pilgrims of hope. Pilgrims of hope is a noun, pilgrims of a thing, of hope. Peregrinantes is a participle. It's a verb used as an adjective. So it's pilgrimaging with an implicit those, we pilgrimaging, those pilgrimaging. In spem means toward hope, into hope. And he loved the image of the church as pilgrim. His letter to the Germans about the synodal way thing they were trying to get away with was a letter to the pilgrim people of God in Germany. He addressed a letter to the church in Nicaragua, the church that pilgrimages in Nicaragua. Same thing with the letter to the U.S. bishops, the church on pilgrimage in the United States. That it's a body moving on a path toward a goal. We are pilgrimaging toward hope, which lies in front of us. You only have hope if you move. That just strikes me as much more meaningful and profound than pilgrims of hope, which just, what does that even mean?
Well, it's that it just, it makes it has that grammatical quality of individualization, right? Like instead of a corporate body, it becomes a characteristic. I'm a pilgrim and I have hope. All right. Well, look, the Pope is dead. Long live the Pope. Please do a few things for us, guys. Pray for the Pope.
Yes, please.
That he might receive his eternal reward.
The mercy of God.
The mercy of God that he longed for, because he was not a man who had any confidence in getting to heaven. His description of himself, which you read before we started here, was that he's a sinner. That was his...
Well, I think he had confidence in God.
God, but not in himself.
Yeah. What a terrible thing to have.
Yeah. So pray for the Pope, and then buy this book, Modernity's Alternative, by Rocco Buttiglione, with the introduction by Pope Francis.
And a lot of things we've been talking about here, I mean, we learned from this. I learned quite a lot from this book. And I learned quite a lot from Francis. I can't sit here and tell you I'm a good Christian, but unfortunately, I can tell you I'm a better Christian than I was before spending 12 years listening to him all the time. And,
I think that's right.
But this book clarified a lot to me that just simply passively listening for 12 years did not clarify. I found it very helpful.
You might be one of us where it's like, I mean, we don't need to get a new topic. It's hard. It's all very difficult. We have like televised popes, and this book is lets us think about it in an ordered kind of way. So I think it's a great benefit.
Yeah, it's nice that the author is a European, so you can kind of mediate between Latin America and us, and bring it closer to the way we think. I think that was part of what made it so helpful for me, reading the Latin Americans directly.
Oh yeah. All your hackles are up. It seems to me that was my experience. Now, if you are still listening, then
somehow by some miracle,
well, you probably really have either left the room and forgot that this was still playing, or you would like to probably enthusiastically purchase this book and learn more about Francis. And so if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, on May 25th, we're actually going to do a formal book launch of this Modernity's Alternative with the author, Rocco, who will be in town.
Coming in from Rome.
He's coming for...
Italy, at any rate.
He'll be our keynote speaker at New Polity's conference. We're pitching too many things at once, but if you haven't bought tickets to come see us in Steubenville, please come see us in Steubenville, May 29th through 31st, newpolity.com/events. But
if you happen to live in the D.C. area and are somehow still listening to this, May 25th at 4 p.m.
Yep.
There will be a book launch at the Catholic University of America. It's at McGivney Hall. It's in the auditorium there. And it will be the author and a couple other scholars. Yep. And then books will be for sale. And it'll be a good time. Come on out.
Snacks?
I'll be there.
Will there be snacks?
Yes.
Oh, a few. Okay. It's good.
Yes.
All right, folks. Thanks so much for listening. And we are excited to see you again soon. God bless. Bye-bye.